On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 14, Iconoclasm and Beauty. The substance time eternity cannot be seen, only what exists in space can be seen. In the beginning was the Word, also means in the beginning was what could be heard and not seen. Yahweh, by nature, is incapable of being depicted. As a superego, he should not have an image, for he is the superego of all egos. He is beyond all the images and forms that arise from this world. The Absolute, in essence, is not confinable within the limits that all representations necessarily possess. Representing God is tantamount to restraining him and reducing him to merely one of the forms he has created. In biblical monotheism, not only are the things of this world no longer seen as divine, but God himself cannot be regarded as an object anymore. Yahweh cannot be represented in the strict sense of the word because he has presented himself once and for all. He is present for all eternity. To see him is to die. Moses himself did not see the Lord on Mount Sinai, he beard him. The seraphim of whom Isaiah speaks, 6-2, hide their faces before the Eternal One. Moses does the same before the burning bush. Then Moses veiled his face for he feared to set his eyes upon God, Exodus 3:6. When Yahweh accompanied the Hebrews in the desert, a cloud hid him from their sight. The Ark of the Covenant is merely an empty throne. And contrary to what is often thought, the sin of the worshippers of the golden calf was not so much the desire to change gods but the desire to render the invisible visible. This provides a precise explication for the attitude of Aaron, who built an altar before the statue of the golden calf and said, "Tomorrow, Yahweh's feast," Exodus 32:5. We know the importance of the desert in biblical symbolism, the desert that erases all representations and rejects them on behalf of the invisible and the uniform. Yahweh's believer must consent to transforming the imagination into a desert, which implies a ban on all representation. Outside of the affirmation of his existence, one has no recourse therefore to any positive attribute to designate or characterize Yahweh. Those provided by the Bible are anthropomorphic attributes that obviously should not be taken literally. Their source, as noted earlier, is the need for the Bible to speak in the language of man. This will lead Maimonides to say, the negative attributes are what must be used to guide the mind to what one should believe about God. This doctrine of negative attributes is a foreshadowing of the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. Not only are depictions of Yahweh forbidden, but images of all worldly things are as well, starting with man of course, as he was created in God's image. These are the instructions concerning iconoclasm first expressed in Exodus. You will make no graven image, nothing that resembles what is in the heavens on high, or on the earth, or in the waters beneath the earth, 20-4. Then in Deuteronomy, do not become corrupt and make a graven image for yourself of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animal on earth, or bird that flies in the air, or lizard that crawls along the ground, or fish that swims in the waters below, 4:16-18. It is difficult to know exactly how far back these prohibitions were made. It seems they were first specifically aimed at representations of the deity and were extended later to all imagistic representations. Over the centuries they were received and interpreted in more or less strict fashion. The Talmudic discussion deals mainly with the term representation. It is generally felt today that only the integral representation, i.e., the three-dimensional representation of the entire human body, is covered by this ban. Standing statuary is prohibited but, on the other hand, busts, portraits, and photographs are not. Certain authors, mystics primarily, held a much more radical view. Whatever the case may be, it is not hard to read a clear anti-aesthetic bias in biblical iconoclasm. In Genesis, moreover, Naamah, sister of Tuval-Cain the smith, bears a name that means beauty. In traditional Judaism, art essentially remains in the liturgical domain. The accent is placed not on God but on his interventions in history. The great men of the Old Testament religion, writes Thorleif Bowman, are depicted not because of their piety or heroism, but because God has acted through them, or spoke through their actions, or, like Ezra, because he read the Word of God. Christian art, which is responsible for so many admirable works in this regard, began as a heresy. Transported to an art-loving people, Christianity became a religion that was more artistic than it would have been if it had remained in the hands of the Judeo-Christians. However, this was only as a result of a long, slow evolution. In the Christianity of the first centuries, iconoclasm was the rule. The Mosaic prohibition against imagistic representations was widely observed. The idea of Jesus' great ugliness was equally widespread. See Tertullian, Origen, Clement of Alexandria. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his letter to Empress Constantia, rejected as utterly impious the desire to provide portraits of Christ. Early Christianity crystallized its rejection of images in its disdain for pagan idols. The first Christians could only speak sarcastically when they mentioned the statues of the gods. To the question, should we make statues and images of God? They all responded in the negative. It was only when the Church, following the compromise of Constantine, began to become more pagan that the birth and development of a Christian iconography was seen, an iconography destined to bloom in extraordinary fashion starting in the 12th and 13th centuries. However, traces of iconoclasm can still be found in Byzantine ritual and even in Protestantism. The Eastern churches long remained enclosed within an impersonal and hieratic imagery. Iconoclasm is also present in Islam, where the rare Arabic Muslim thinkers who concern themselves with aesthetics practically only envisioned art in its abstract form. The iconographic aspiration, as shown by Henry Corbin, was most often transferred to the imaginal. It was especially in the hadiths that the anti-figurative attitude was expressed, generally in the form of curses. The image makers would be punished on the last day by God's judgment, who would impose upon them the impossible task of resuscitating their works. Only God, Asma Allah al-Husna, is al-Musawwir, meaning the fashioner of forms. Here again is a case of not competing with God in his personal domain. Jean-Paul Charnay rightly describes Islam as an abstract religion that represses even simply aesthetic anthropomorphic and zoomorphic symbols and representations by its refusal of idolatry. The biblical refusal of the image can be read on several levels. Its primary role is tied to the fight against idolatry. In its strict sense, the idol, eidolon, is what can be seen, that which acquires a status of existence through its created visual representation. To represent God by a form, any form, is to necessarily represent him as that very form. Now God, who has created all forms, cannot be reduced to a particular form. Restricting him to a given form amounts to reducing the universal to a particular, to treating the being as if he were no more than a being, an inconceivable and blasphemous attitude from the biblical perspective. Between figurative art and abstract art, only the second is truly in conformity with the instructions of Moses, which engenders a certain underdevelopment of the form's meaning. Yaakov Agam goes so far as to say, not only is it impossible for figurative art to be Jewish, it is preeminently anti-Jewish, forbidden by the Bible. Chaim Potok's novel My Name is Asher Lev features a child who transgresses the biblical law concerning the non-representation of the image. The emptying of the human representation, on the other hand, goes hand in hand with the abandonment of human particularity and diversity, with the emptying of human norms as they express this particularity and diversity, for they are themselves images. Furthermore, it is sufficient to look at the role they play in Christian art. The artists naturally represented God with features familiar to them. They gave him the ideal physical configuration implied by their own heritage and kinship connections, as it was unthinkable to them that God could have the appearance of something completely other. Every representation refers to a particularity and reflects a particularity. Every representation forms a mirror by and in which a type exalts itself and becomes sublime. Only non-representation can reflect the invisible and unnameable. Only nothingness can echo nothingness. This is why, from the biblical perspective, which interprets this nothingness, this absolute void, to be absolute plenitude, only the absence of form can express the presence of all forms, in the same way that only man's silence can express the words of God. This is the ideal of the empty temple. An ideal that foreshadows messianic times, in which specific differences will be abolished, in which all men will be equals among equals, in which nothing will no longer be able to be compared to anything. The messianic world, specifies the Zohar, will be a world without images, in which there will no longer be any comparison possible between the image and what it represents. Non-figuration thereby brings us back to flat rationality. Reality is no longer perceived, sensed, and represented as such. It is no longer drawn from sensibility and aesthetics but from pure intellect and morality, an intellect that is itself operating on the basis of an abstraction where signs are no longer exchanged against the real but restricted to exchange among themselves. Reality should not be seen and constructed based on the perception we have of it, it must be understood. Extensions and contemporary points of comparison with the Mosaic ban on representation have often been sought, for example, with regard to abstract art, whose birth and development coincide metaphorically with that of structural linguistics and the internationalist ideal of the removal of borders, experienced in concrete terms. In his essay The Iconoclasts, Jean-Joseph Gou raises the question, wouldn't it be the ancestral proximity to the iconoclast exigency that puts Marx and Freud, two faithless but indubitable sons of Judaism, in the position of perceiving all representation as imaginary and everything imaginary as ignorance? This is where, he adds, the Jewishness of Marx and Freud, which has only been explained anecdotally up to now, will no doubt find a true basis. He then concludes, so this would not be by chance, but through the effective digging into a common ground, that we would encounter today, whether through abstract art, utopia, standards, the differences between the sexes, the question of the temple with no images. Certain ideological phenomena such as abstract painting, Freudianism, or Marxism could thereby be interpreted as a resurgence of a very old approach perpetually going from the universal to the particular, from the unity of the law to the diversity of the signs. An entire aspect of Western modernity, writes Gu again, finds resonance with the old iconoclast exigency which makes up the base of an ancient divergence, and from this point forward, thinkers of Judaic filiation actively intervene at the tip of this modernity to mark out where it is going, not truly in opposition to it but rather in advance of it. To be Jewish, Josie Eisenberg thinks, is to have a series of discourses by God and about God readily available, in order to know the invisible, incorporeal, intangible God. It is to search for God through a language for which the entire history of Israel is only a sonorous echo. And again, one can easily define the Jewish faith in the same terms used by Lacan to describe the unconscious, and say that it is structured like a language. This language is furthermore not without a relationship to the unconscious, since all Jewish exegesis consists of seeking, beyond what has been said, for what the biblical discourse leaves unsaid. This opinion seems to closely echo what Jean-Joseph Gu says. When the depicted representation is entirely replaced by the logos that absolutely predated it, it is clearly no longer commentary but a substitute. So it should be no surprise to see flourishing, in the field of contemporary ideological discourse, at the same time Judeo-Christian values are depositing themselves there in secular forms like sediment, an entire thematic of non-representation and the search for what is left unsaid, for which structural linguistics, not purely descriptive history, abstract art, and the 1001 theories of the unconscious constitute so many epiphenomena. In each case, it is a question of describing without depicting, of considering the world in some way as a coded ensemble whose key lies beyond visible appearances, of considering it, not as the sight of forms to create, but a mystery to interpret, a puzzle to put back together, in which man, taken not as creator but as an intermediary, has the task of discovering a hidden meaning, a necessarily unique meaning that predates his very existence. The idea of the world as cryptogram and that of an absolute signifier allowing it to be deciphered, who might be Yahweh, but could just as well be the unconscious or the class struggle, then functions as diastole and systole. If the world is in fact something other than what it is, there necessarily must be a universal key, which cannot be ignored and exceeded, which allows one to know what part of the world is being and what is not. Man no longer acts, he is acted upon as the decipherer of hieroglyphs. For just as Freud gave himself the task of finding a meaning to dreams, which he compared to hieroglyphs, Marx, for his part, took on the goal, according to his own terms, of deciphering the hieroglyph of value. And this is why Freud interpreted dreams by following Joseph's example with the Pharaoh precisely, Genesis 41 1-43, or even that of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 4:16-24. By pronouncing a general, universal law located beyond particular events or forms of behavior, Marx and Freud emerged from the Egypt of hieroglyphs, hieroglyphs of dreams or hieroglyphs of production, and left the foreign, specifically pagan land of particular meanings and, with a unique operating sign, reduced them and brought them back to an equally unique signifier. Freud's aesthetic conceptions in this regard, studied by Gu, are notable. Freud began to say that the basis of an artwork attracted him more than the qualities of its form or technique. What stirred his emotions was the artist's intention. He felt only what he could understand. He tried to translate the artist's intention into words. He did not play with the form but with the depths, not with the physical aspects but with its meaning. He only played if it did not disorient his intelligence. This is why he did not like music, far from stopping at what distinguished the artwork and seriously considering the tangible enigma it represents. He sees it only as an opportunity to interpret a meaning, to grasp a depth that would be communicated by artists through their work. It is only transmitted ideas, signified intentions, that interest him. A remarkable passage that expresses many of the oppositions described here earlier between the felt and the understood, soul and mind, form and depths, image and concepts, style and meaning. We know the kind of attraction the figure of Moses exerted on Freud. Now it was precisely Moses who brought down from Mount Sinai the tablets of the law and with them the iconoclast prohibition. In Moses and Monotheism, Freud himself said that the ban on representation implies the relegation of sensorial perception into the background with respect to the abstract idea, a triumph of the intellect over the senses and the renunciation of the passions. Likewise, with Levi-Strauss, the theory of the prohibition against incest as a universal given characteristic of the human species, a theory directly associated to the Freudian Oedipal theory, for which it is a kind of ethnographical and rationalizing reinterpretation, comes, on the one hand, from a renewed search for a general law that exists outside all particulars and, primarily on the other, interprets this general law as a rupture with the natural world, to the extent that the ban on incest, which most often means a prohibition on incest with the mother, retraces the old anti-idolatrous ban directed against the family-like relationship between man and the earth mother. In the biblical thematic, idolatry is fornication, and more specifically incestuous fornication, because in paganism man was engendered by the being who is the world, whereas in the Bible he was created by Yahweh. This is why, considering the general meaning of this data, Gu concludes, it appears to me that the ban on depicting the deity is a radical form of the prohibition against incest, its Judaic form, and that Moses' dreadful display of wrath toward the idolatress is suggestive of the threat of castration that accompanies the forbidden love of the mother. A connection could be drawn between the secular ascent of biblical values in today's world and the depreciation of beauty that characterizes it on so many levels. Beauty today is often depreciated as monotonous or denounced as a constraining norm, when it is not simply reduced to a pure spectacle accompanied by a rehabilitation or even exaltation of deformity and ugliness, as can be seen in many areas. The degeneration of beauty and the promotion of ugliness, tied to the flowering of intellectualism, could certainly be part of the Umwertung stigmatized by Nietzsche. The contrast with paganism is striking. In the Bible, the beautiful is not necessarily good and ugly is not necessarily evil. It can even happen, and this is what the Umwertung consists of, that good may be good precisely because of its ugliness, just as the superb is weak in proportion to its prowess, and that evil is handsome precisely because it is evil. Lucifer, as everyone knows, is an angel glowing with light. The devil often adorns himself with all the paraphernalia of seduction, whereas the arms of Yahweh, says Isaiah, have grown like a root in arid soil, without beauty or comeliness to attract our eyes. 53-2. In paganism, on the contrary, good cannot be separated from beauty, and this is normal, because the good is form, the consummate forms of worldly things. Consequently, art cannot be separated from religion. Art is sacred. Not only can the gods be represented, but art is how they can be represented, and insofar as men perpetually assure chem of representation, they have a full status of existence. All European spirituality is based on representation as mediation between the visible and the invisible, on representation by means of depicted figures and signs exchanged against a meaning intimately tied to the real, the very guarantee of this incessant and mutual conversion of the sign and meaning. Beauty is the visible sign of what is good, ugliness the visible sign of not only what is deformed or spoiled but bad. For the ancient Greeks, as shown by Karl Karagny, solemnity is inseparable from a visual, tangible representation. It is through the fusion of the aesthetic and the sacred that the religious sentiment attains its peak. Among the Greeks, says Hegel, as well, art was the highest form in which people could represent the gods and realize their truth. All beings, men and gods, reveal themselves in tangible fashion by their actions. Plato himself does not describe the empire of Atlantis or the ideal city of the Republic in terms that are any different from those used by Homer to depict Ulysses' court in Ithaca or the walls of Troy. Like Wagner, Nietzsche gave aesthetics the highest standing. The dramatic artwork is likely to replace religion. He adds, that we are already the images and aesthetic projections of the true creator of this world of art, and as works of art we attain a higher dignity, for existence and the world are only justified eternally to the extent they are aesthetic phenomena. It is from this criterion, moreover, that Nietzsche, interpreting Christian art as an unconscious heresy inside Christianity itself, condemns the Christian teaching, which is and wants to be only moral and which relegates art, every art, to the realm of lies. With its absolute standards, beginning with the truthfulness of God, it negates, judges, and damns art. Behind this mode of thought and valuation, which must be hostile to art if it is at all genuine, he adds, I never failed to sense a hostility to life, a furious, vengeful antipathy to life itself. Walter F. Ordo labels myth as the true word, meaning the word that echoes the truth of the world. Henry Corbin defines it as imaginal language, for the imagination constructs itself from images. In paganism, the foundational myth, the archetype, quite naturally sits in opposition to the law. Mythos against logos. From the start, the pagan sacred is connected to visible, tangible reality, even and especially when it idealizes it. A tree, a hill, a waterway can be sacred, they are the sacred. Myth is not a byproduct of a linear history hypostatized by moralism. Myth makes history, it is what, writes Gilbert Durand, goes before history, affirms it and legitimizes it. Without mythical structures, no historical intelligence is possible. This is why modern theoreticians of depth psychology, namely Jung and his successors, when they pore over primordial works and archetypes, all notions deemed repugnant by Will Herberg and described by him as close to the pagan abominations of Canaan, are also working as historians. They are teaching us about the roots of our own history, as inseparable from a certain number of forms created by man. Paganism leads us into the marvels of sacred art, with biblical monotheism we are given an empty temple.